In the early 1800s, winter in the American Rockies was not a backdrop. It was a verdict. If you lived above the plains, Wyoming, Montana, the high valleys of Colorado, you didn't ask whether winter would be hard. You asked how hard it would hit you and what it would take from your family before it moved on. Men talked about winter the way sailors talked about storms, quietly, with respect, with the understanding that preparation was the only defense. Once the snow set in, there were no second chances. By late fall, every household knew the rule: 4 cords of firewood minimum, 5 if you had children, more if the cabin leaked heat. That wood meant warmth, cooking, light, and survival. No wood meant cold. Cold meant sickness. Sickness meant death. So men worked fast. They split until their hands cracked. They stacked wood under lean-tos along cabin walls, under eaves, anywhere they could find space. They covered piles with canvas hides, tarps weighed down by rocks. From a distance it looked like preparation. But winter didn't care how much wood you had. It cared how dry it was. The Rockies were not kind enough to give clean, dry cold. They gave freeze-thaw cycles, rain that turned to sleet, snow that melted at noon and refroze by nightfall, Chinook winds that soaked everything in a single afternoon. Firewood absorbed that moisture like a sponge, and wet wood doesn't burn the way people expect. It smokes, it hisses, it steals heat instead of giving it. It clogs chimneys, it turns a warm fire into a weak, choking flame. Most homesteaders accepted this as part of mountain life. They burned more, they split more, they suffered through it. But one man looked at the problem and saw something different. He didn't ask how to cut more wood. He asked how to stop losing heat before the fire even started. That question, simple, direct, and practical, was the beginning of an idea that would quietly change how one cabin faced winter and why it stayed warmer when others did not. The man at the center of this story was not famous. He wasn't educated in engineering. He didn't invent new tools or write manuals. He was a working carpenter who paid attention. Like many men who moved west, he brought habits from back east. He knew how to build square walls, tight joints, solid roofs. He understood wood. He respected stone. By frontier standards, his cabin was well built. It stood straight. It held heat as well as any other home in the valley. Yet every winter the same problem returned. Not lack of effort, not lack of fuel, but waste. He noticed it in the mornings first. Fires that should have lasted the night burned out early. Logs that looked sound refused to catch. Chimneys smoked instead of drawing clean. He split wood again and again, only to find the inside damp and cold. The common explanation was simple: that's the mountains. Freeze, thaw, soak, refreeze. Everyone dealt with it. Everyone complained. Everyone accepted it. But he didn't stop there. He started watching the wood instead of blaming the weather. He noticed which pieces burned clean and which didn't. He noticed how wood left near the ground stayed wet longer, even under cover. He noticed how logs brought inside for a day burned better the next night. That detail mattered. Most men saw firewood as a quantity problem. More wood meant more heat. He began to see it as a condition problem. Dry wood worked. Wet wood failed. And most of the effort of winter was wasted fighting moisture, not cold. He also noticed something else. When he dug fence posts or repaired footings in late fall, the soil below stayed unfrozen long after the air turned sharp. Down there, things didn't swing wildly. They stayed steady. That planted a thought he couldn't shake. What if the problem wasn't how much wood he cut, but where he kept it? What if the answer wasn't above ground under tarps and canvas fighting storms, but below ground where the earth stayed calm? It sounded wrong at first, even to him. Digging beneath your own house wasn't something sensible men talked about. It risked water collapse and failure. And failure on the frontier wasn't embarrassing, it was deadly. Still, the idea kept returning, quietly, persistently, and by the time the summer sun hardened the ground he had made his decision, He wasn't going to fight winter harder. He was going to let the earth do the work instead. When he finally said it out loud, the reaction was immediate. "You're going to dig under your house." Men laughed because they pictured the worst. Flooding, collapse, rot, a cabin sinking into mud because someone thought he knew better than the mountains. On the frontier, that kind of mistake didn't just cost pride, it cost lives. Digging a hole near your home was one thing. A root cellar off to the side made sense, but cutting into the ground beneath your own floor, that sounded careless, dangerous, stupid. But this wasn't an impulsive idea. He wasn't chasing comfort. He was solving a problem he understood well. The goal was simple: keep firewood dry, stable, and accessible, no matter what the weather did above ground. To do that, he planned 3 things most people missed. First, the chamber would not sit directly under the cabin's main supports. It would be offset, leaving the foundation untouched. The house would stand on its own. The ground below would carry its own load. Second, water would never be allowed to linger. Any moisture that entered had to move downhill and away. That meant slope gravel and an exit, not sealed walls and wishful thinking. Third, the space had to breathe. Not wide openings that let in snow or animals, but controlled airflow, enough to move moisture out without letting weather in. He wasn't trying to build a basement. He was building a dry zone. That distinction mattered. The digging began in late summer when the ground was firm but workable. He worked slowly, removing soil by hand, shoring walls as he went. No shortcuts. No guessing. Every inch was measured against one question: what happens here when the snow melts? Neighbors stopped by to watch. Some warned him, others joked. A few shook their heads and walked away. Even his family worried, not loudly, not publicly, but in the quiet way that matters most. Trust on the frontier was built on outcomes, not explanations. He understood that. So he didn't argue. He dug. By early fall, the shape was clear: a low chamber, cool and dark, gravel underfoot, walls that felt solid when you leaned against them, a space that didn't smell wet, a space that felt calm. Most people still thought it would fail. Winter would decide. Most people judge winter by what they feel on their skin: wind, snow, cold air cutting through wool. The earth doesn't work that way. A few feet below the surface, the temperature barely changes. While the air above swings from thaw to deep freeze, the soil settles into a narrow range and stays there, day after day, night after night, even in the worst winters. This man understood that difference, even if he didn't use scientific words for it. He had seen it while digging posts and footings. Frost bit hard at the surface, but below it the ground stayed workable. Damp, yes, but steady. No wild swings. No sudden freezes. No soaking rain driven sideways by wind. That stability was the key. Firewood fails in winter for 2 reasons. Liquid water gets into it, and moisture in the air stays trapped around it. Above ground, you fight both at once. Snow melts, soaks the wood, then refreezes. Tarps trap damp air. Canvas breathes too much. Wind drives moisture where it doesn't belong. Even careful stacks turn into cold, wet blocks. Below ground, those forces weaken. Gravity works in your favor. Water wants to move down and away. If you give it a path, gravel instead of soil, slope instead of flat, it leaves. It doesn't pool. It doesn't creep back up. Air behaves differently too. Moist air moves toward balance. In a controlled underground space, it drifts out slowly through small vents instead of being trapped under covers. The surrounding earth absorbs excess humidity without complaint. The result is not warmth, it's consistency. And consistency is what wood needs. Wood kept above freezing but below saturation continues to dry, slowly, quietly, even in winter. It doesn't freeze solid. It doesn't lock together. It doesn't steal heat just to burn. This wasn't luck. It was physics, whether anyone in the valley wanted to admit it or not. The earth didn't care what his neighbors believed. It did what it always does. And when the first real storms arrived, that quiet underground space was already doing its job without smoke noise or effort. On the surface, most wood storage looked the same. Stacks leaned against cabins. Lean-tos faced away from the wind. Tarps were pulled tight and weighed down with stone. It looked careful, it looked prepared, and in mild winters it was enough. But harsh winters don't reward appearances, they reward systems. Above-ground storage fails because it fights the wrong enemy. People think snow is the problem. It isn't. Moisture is. And moisture moves in ways tarps can't control. Rain blows sideways. Snow melts under sun and refreezes at night. Warm air trapped under canvas condenses and drips back into the pile. Even when the top stays dry, the bottom wicks water from the ground. Over time, the whole stack equalizes to damp. The underground chamber avoided all of that by design. First, it removed exposure. No wind-driven rain, no drifting snow, no sun warming one side and freezing the other. The environment stopped swinging. Second, it controlled water instead of trying to block it. The gravel floor acted like a drain, not a barrier. Any liquid that entered moved down and away. There was no place for water to sit and soak. Third, it allowed controlled airflow, not enough to bring in weather, but enough to move moisture out. That balance mattered. Too much air and you invite cold and damp. Too little and humidity builds. The small vents solved that quietly. Most important of all, the wood never froze solid. Frozen wood locks moisture inside. When you bring it to the fire, that moisture has to go somewhere. It turns to steam, steals heat, and smothers flame. Wood kept above freezing avoids that trap. That single advantage multiplied all winter. Fires lit faster. Burns lasted longer. Chimneys stayed cleaner. And because the wood burned efficiently, less of it was needed. That meant fewer trips outside, less exposure, less exhaustion. On the frontier, energy saved was survival gained. This wasn't clever construction. It was simple alignment, placing wood where the natural rules favored it, instead of fighting those rules every day. When winter tightened its grip, the difference became obvious. While others worked harder just to stay cold, this cabin stayed warm with less effort. And that's when people stopped laughing. The real test didn't come gently. It never does in the high country. Early storms were light and deceptive. Powder snow that blew off roofs and settled in drifts. Men relaxed. Woodpiles still looked fine. Tarps held. Nobody admitted concern. Then winter showed its teeth. A warm wind came down out of the mountains and turned snow into water in a single afternoon. Roofs shed melt. Hillsides ran. Wood stacks soaked through top to bottom. By nightfall, the temperature dropped hard. Everything froze exactly where it sat. By morning, most firewood in the valley was locked together like stone. Men swung mauls just to break pieces loose. Splitting green wood in sub-zero air became routine. Fires that should have lasted through the night burned out before dawn. Smoke rolled back into rooms. Chimneys clogged faster than they could be cleaned. This was the kind of winter that punished shortcuts. Inside the underground chamber, nothing changed. The temperature stayed steady. The air stayed dry. The wood didn't freeze. It didn't sweat. It waited. While others fought their fuel every morning, he lifted an armload through the trap door and lit a fire with a single match. The flame caught clean. No hiss, no smoke, no struggle. That difference mattered more than comfort. It changed how the day began. Warm fires meant hands worked better. Tools didn't bite as hard. Children stayed inside instead of huddling near weak heat. Sleep came easier because the fire held through the night. Outside, the valley burned through wood at a desperate pace. Some families used twice what they expected. By midwinter, fence rails disappeared. Old furniture went into stoves. Every cold snap brought new fear. Meanwhile, his supply shrank slowly, predictably, exactly the way dry wood is supposed to. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Neighbors noticed smoke or the lack of it. They noticed steady heat when visiting. They noticed fewer trips outside in dangerous weather. They noticed a cabin that stayed warm without burning itself empty. By midwinter, the jokes stopped. No one said much. Frontier pride runs quiet. But men began to understand something uncomfortable. The problem was never the cold. It was how they had been fighting it. And one man, by stepping below ground instead of stacking higher, had found a better way. Most men believed heat came from effort, more splitting, more hauling, more burning. That belief was wrong. Heat comes from efficiency. When you burn wet firewood, the fire spends its strength drying the wood before it ever warms the room. Every pound of moisture has to be boiled off. That costs energy that should be heating walls, floors, and bodies. In simple terms, wet wood eats heat. Dry wood does the opposite. It ignites quickly. It burns evenly. It releases energy as flame instead of smoke. The fire stays clean, steady, and predictable. That difference showed up clearly over the course of the winter. While other households burned through cords at an alarming rate, this cabin used far less. Fires lasted longer. Overnight burns actually lasted overnight. Morning fires didn't start from cold ash. They started from glowing coals. That meant fewer reloads and fewer cold starts. Cold starts are expensive. They demand kindling time and constant tending. Steady fires are cheap. They hold heat and release it slowly. Chimneys told the story too. Wet wood creates creosote fast. Thick, sticky buildup that chokes draft and risks chimney fires. Men spent hours scraping flues just to keep smoke out of their homes. Some didn't catch it in time. Dry wood burned clean. Draft stayed strong. Maintenance dropped. Inside the house, the difference wasn't dramatic at first glance. It wasn't luxury. It was reliability. Rooms stayed warm longer. Floors didn't ice over by morning. Water buckets didn't freeze overnight. That stability changed behavior. People slept better. They worked better. They wasted less energy just trying to stay warm. Over weeks and months that added up. The math became impossible to argue with. Same winter, same elevation, same size cabins. But one household used a fraction of the wood. Not because they were stronger, not because they were luckier, but because they stopped wasting heat before it ever reached the room. That was the lesson winter taught the hard way. On the frontier, strength helped you survive a bad day. Efficiency helped you survive the whole season. Frontier people trusted results more than arguments. You could talk all day at the trading post, but talk didn't warm cabins. When winter dragged on, the only thing that mattered was what still worked in February. That's when the difference became measurable. A traveling surveyor stopped through the valley midwinter. He carried a mercury thermometer, rare and expensive at the time. He wasn't there to settle debates. He was recording conditions. Out of curiosity, he stepped into several cabins on the same afternoon. The weather outside was brutal. Sub-zero air, hard wind, the kind of cold that punished mistakes. Inside most homes, fires were burning hard just to keep rooms livable. Even so, temperatures hovered in the high 50s. People wore coats indoors. Water buckets skimmed with ice by morning. Then he stepped into the cabin with the underground wood storage. The fire wasn't roaring. It wasn't being fed constantly. It was steady, calm, controlled. The thermometer climbed past 60, then higher. Nearly 10 degrees warmer than neighboring homes using less wood. That number spread fast. 10 degrees doesn't sound dramatic until you live in it. It's the difference between waking up stiff or rested, between frost on the inside of windows or clear glass, between keeping children healthy or fighting coughs all winter. But the temperature wasn't the only number that mattered. Wood consumption told a bigger story. By late winter, most households had burned through far more than planned. Some were scraping by on scraps, others were eyeing fence rails and furniture. This cabin wasn't. The underground chamber still held dry wood. Not because winter was mild, but because the system kept working no matter what the weather did above ground. That changed how people thought. Arguments faded, pride softened. Curiosity replaced skepticism. Men didn't ask if it worked anymore, they asked how it was built. And quietly, one by one, they began to copy what had proven itself under the only test that mattered: winter. Change on the frontier never happened all at once. It moved slowly, quietly, one man watching another, one winter remembered longer than a conversation. After the numbers spread, people didn't rush to apologize. That wasn't the way of the mountains. Instead, they showed up with questions, practical ones. How deep did you dig? How did you keep water out? Where did the air move? They weren't looking for theory. They wanted steps they could trust with their families. The first copies were cautious. Small chambers dug beside cabins, not beneath them. Gravel floors added where there had only been dirt. Vent gaps cut where walls had once been sealed tight. Men tested pieces of the idea before committing to the whole. The results were the same. Dry wood, cleaner fires, less waste. By the next fall, a few bolder homesteaders went further. They added interior access so they could load stoves without stepping into storms. Others angled entrances downhill so snow wouldn't drift inside. Some combined food storage with firewood, learning that the same conditions that preserved wood also protected potatoes and apples. No two builds were identical. Frontier builders rarely copied anything exactly, but the principles stayed consistent. Sati, keep water moving, never trapped. Let air circulate, never stagnate. Use the earth's stability instead of fighting weather. Within a few years, versions of the underground wood shelter appeared across the region. Not because someone declared it best practice, but because it solved a real problem better than anything else. By the time newer settlers arrived, they saw these chambers as normal, sensible. Just another example of how people who survived long enough learned to build smarter instead of harder. The idea lost its reputation as stupid because it kept passing the same test year after year. Winter came. The system held. That's how frontier knowledge spread. Not through books or experts, but through outcomes no one could ignore. This story was never really about firewood. It was about how people solve problems when failure has real consequences. On the frontier, you couldn't afford to chase clever ideas that only sounded good. You also couldn't afford to ignore better solutions just because they looked strange at first. Survival demanded something harder than strength or optimism. It demanded clear thinking under pressure. Most settlers fought winter head-on. They cut more wood, burned more fuel, worked harder each year as conditions got worse. That approach feels natural. When something hurts, you push back. But pushing back isn't always smart. The man who dug beneath his house didn't defeat winter. He stepped around it. He reduced friction instead of increasing effort. He asked where energy was being wasted, then removed the waste. That mindset mattered more than the structure itself. The underground chamber worked because it respected basic realities. Water always finds the lowest point. Air always seeks balance. Temperature stabilizes underground. Those rules existed long before cabins did. Ignoring them didn't make them go away. Working with them made life easier. That's a lesson many people miss even today. Modern life encourages excess. More fuel, more power, more insulation, more systems layered on top of problems that could often be solved by simpler design. We've gotten used to overpowering inefficiency instead of correcting it. Frontier builders didn't have that luxury. Every wasted log meant another hour of labor. Every smoky fire meant sickness. Every mistake multiplied over a long winter. Efficiency wasn't about comfort, it was about survival margins. The underground shelter didn't just save wood, it saved time, energy, and health. It reduced daily strain. It turned winter from a constant emergency into a manageable season. That's why the idea lasted, not because it was impressive, not because it was innovative, but because it worked quietly day after day when conditions were at their worst. The frontier rewarded people who paid attention to how things actually behaved, not how they wished they behaved. That lesson didn't disappear with log cabins. We just stopped listening. It's easy to dismiss frontier solutions as relics. Different time, different tools, different risks. But the core problems haven't changed as much as we like to think. Cold still drains energy. Moisture still ruins fuel. Waste still hides inside systems we stop questioning. Most modern homes burn fuel the same way frontier cabins burned wood, by overpowering inefficiency instead of removing it. We add insulation, turn up thermostats, buy bigger heaters, and accept high consumption as normal. When something doesn't work well, the answer is usually more. More heat, more power, more cost. The underground wood chamber worked because it attacked loss at the source. It didn't create heat. It preserved it. It made fuel behave the way it was supposed to behave before it ever touched a flame. That principle applies far beyond firewood. Dry fuel, whether wood pellets or any burnable material, always performs better. Stable temperature always improves efficiency. Moisture control always matters more than brute force. Modern builders rediscover this every time they design earth-bermed homes, root cellars, thermal mass walls, or passive solar systems. The names change. The science doesn't. Even off-grid living today faces the same trade-offs frontier families faced. Every wasted unit of energy means more labor, more cost, more exposure. People who live close to their fuel supply understand this instinctively. The frontier didn't reward complexity, it rewarded reliability. And reliability came from systems that worked even when conditions turned ugly. The underground chamber didn't depend on perfect weather. It didn't rely on constant attention. It didn't fail when storms stacked up. It worked quietly because it was aligned with natural forces instead of resisting them. That's the part worth remembering. Not the hole, not the trapdoor, not even the firewood. The mindset. Ask where energy is being lost. Ask how nature already solves the problem. Build once, benefit all season. That approach doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to anyone who values resilience over convenience and long-term stability over short-term fixes. Frontier people didn't romanticize hardship. They tried to reduce it wherever they could. The smartest ones didn't survive because they worked harder. They survived because they learned where not to work at all. Long after the cabins collapsed and the families moved on, the ground remembered. If you know where to look in the high country, you can still find traces of these underground shelters. Not obvious structures, not standing walls, just signs that something thoughtful once existed there. A shallow depression where nothing grows well. A line of stones half buried on a slope. A patch of gravel that drains too cleanly for the surrounding soil. These aren't ruins in the romantic sense, they're footprints of good decisions. Most frontier buildings disappeared quickly once they were abandoned. Wood rotted, roofs failed, walls leaned and fell. But underground work lasted longer because it wasn't fighting the elements, it was cooperating with them. Drainage still works decades later. Slope still moves water away. Earth still stabilizes temperature. That's the kind of legacy practical people leave behind. What's striking is how rarely these shelters were written about. They weren't celebrated. They weren't patented. They spread quietly from neighbor to neighbor because they solved a problem that everyone recognized. No one built them to impress anyone else. They built them to get through winter. That humility mattered. Frontier culture respected results, not credit. If something worked, it stayed. If it failed, it vanished. The underground wood chamber stayed because it earned its place. Every year it existed. Over time, the idea blended into common practice. New settlers saw them and assumed they'd always been there. Old settlers stopped talking about why they built them. Knowledge like that doesn't announce itself. It settles in. Eventually, modern materials and centralized fuel made the problem less visible. Delivered firewood, coal, oil, gas, electricity. Heat became something you paid for instead of managed. But the ground didn't change. It still offers stability. It still manages moisture. It still rewards designs that respect gravity and temperature. The legacy of those underground shelters isn't nostalgia. It's a reminder. Good solutions don't need to be loud. They don't need approval. They don't need to look smart. They just need to work when conditions are worst. And if they do, the earth will remember them long after opinions fade. In the end, everything came down to one simple decision. He stopped trying to keep winter out and started designing a place where winter didn't matter. That was the real breakthrough. Most people built defenses, thicker walls, more tarps, bigger stacks. They reacted to weather as if it were an enemy that could be beaten back with enough effort. But effort has limits, weather doesn't. The underground shelter worked because it removed the problem from the fight entirely. Below ground wind had no voice, snow had no weight, temperature had no mood swings. The earth became a buffer, not perfect but reliable. Once firewood lived in that stable zone, everything else followed naturally. Fires burned cleaner because fuel behaved properly. Heat stayed longer because less was wasted driving off moisture. Chimneys stayed open because creosote never had a chance to build. Nothing in the system required constant attention. No daily adjustments, no emergency fixes. It ran in the background while life went on above it. That was the frontier ideal at its best. Build once, maintain lightly, let nature carry the load. The idea looked stupid because it didn't look strong. It didn't involve thicker logs or bigger axes. It involved digging slow, quiet, unglamorous work that paid off months later when no one was watching. Frontier history is full of that kind of wisdom, not the dramatic moments but the patient ones. The kind that turned survival from a daily battle into a steady routine. This wasn't innovation for its own sake. It was problem-solving without ego. And that's why it lasted. When winter came again, the shelter didn't need to prove itself. It simply did what it was built to do, year after year, storm after storm. That's the difference between a clever idea and a durable one. One gets attention, the other gets remembered.